I'm Gray Brown, and I welcome you to the Osler Literary Roundtable, where today we're honored to host Dr. John Hope Franklin. Thank you. The Osler Literary Roundtable, also known as OLR, is a part of the literary arts program offered by the Health Arts Network at Duke, also known as HAND. OLR meets each Friday from 12 to 1. Some weeks we host guest readers. Others we discuss short stories and share an open meetings. OLR is open to everyone, and we would love to have you join us. We have a calendar out at the front table if you would like to pick out one. This is our January, February, March. There are also some printouts at the end of December. And there's a sign-up sheet out there if you'd like to be on our mailing list. Next week, we'll be meeting in the Medical Center boardroom, same time, 12 to 1, in the Yellow Zone of the Clinics building for our holiday open reading. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. By the sign-up sheet, you'll also find copies of our latest collection of poetry by Duke patients, staff, visitors, and volunteers. They wrote us a poem. It's $10, and it's a great, quick holiday gift for those who are still left hanging on your list. You'll also find copies of our calendar for all the HAND programs, including musicians in the Medical Center and our exhibits in the galleries. So please pick those up as you leave. We thank the John Hope Franklin Center today for providing us their lovely room. And thanks to the HAND staff for their work today. And thank you to the Regulator Bookshop for bringing books. That's all I have. We're also honored today to have the Director of Health Arts Network at Duke, our own Linda Belans, interviewing Dr. Franklin. Linda Belans became the Director of the Health Arts Network at Duke 2.5 years ago, and we are so blessed. She's the co-coordinator and host of Do No Harm, a radio magazine series on medical ethics produced at Duke University, winner of a Gracie Allen Award for Women in Broadcasting, and a Silver Reel Award for National Public Affairs Programming. She is the creator and original host of The State of Things and a contributing arts writer for the Raleigh News Observer. She was a planner and presenter for the Governor James B. Hunt's Initiative on Race Relations and serves on the advisory boards of Project Compassion and Gaston College Prep, a public charter school for historically undeserved middle schoolers.
Underserved.
Underserved?
Underserved, yeah. They're quite deserving.
Underserved middle schoolers. Sorry. Middle schoolers, you never know what they're up to.
You are so right.
I mean, you don't know.
I agree.
You know. And without any further ado, Dr. John Hope Franklin. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you again to the Franklin Center. To be sitting in the room in a building named for the man is this is a dream come true for me. When I left the radio program, The State of Things, the only regret that I had was that I never got to interview Dr. Franklin. And here it is in his building. Here are some things that you might know about Dr. Franklin. He is the historian's historian. I'll wait. And the scholar's scholar. After graduating from Fisk, he received his PhD from Harvard, became the first African-American historian to hold a full professorship at a white institution, Brooklyn College, and was the chair of the University of Chicago's History Department, and the John B. Duke Professor at Duke. He has taught at St. Augustine and North Carolina Central University. Dr. Franklin has been associated with 4 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, and Clinton. He chaired the advisory board for One America, President Clinton's initiative on race. He is the author of the bestseller From Slavery to Freedom, which has sold 3.5 million copies. He holds 130 honorary degrees. Where do you put them all? He was instrumental in assisting Thurgood Marshall win the Brown versus Board of Education and appeared with Desmond Tutu in a documentary called A Journey Towards Peace. He has published textbooks that are pretty much the state of the art. Here are things you might not know. Dr. Franklin is from Oklahoma. In 1934, he tried to hand President Franklin Roosevelt a petition calling for action in response to the Cordy Creek lynching, which we'll hear about. He was threatened with lynching himself, and years later, many years later, was asked by a white woman to check his coat at the hotel where he was there to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Dr. Franklin was going to become a lawyer, to be his dad's sidekick, his dad an attorney. And the reason? Because he wanted to collect the payments his dad wasn't getting. But that changed, and we'll hear about that. You might not know that Dr. Franklin is part Choctaw and part Chickasaw. Dr. Franklin was married for more than a half a century to the late Aurelia Franklin, and together they have a son, Whit, who works still at the Smithsonian. Dr. Franklin sings. And he's a highly regarded orchid grower. He's just returned from a national book tour for his new book, and he will do signings. Thank you to the Regulator Bookshop. The new book, Mirror to America. You've just come back from a whirlwind tour that would wear anybody out. In 1976, I think you were maybe, 60-something, you said you wanted to slow down. What happened?
Well, a lot happened. That year was the year of the bicentennial of our independence, and I was selected as the fifth annual Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities. And I was off to the races after that. I lectured. The Humanities lecture was usually given in one place, Washington. But I said if it's a National Humanities lecture, it ought to be given in more than one place. And I gave it in, not the same lecture, but I gave a series of lectures in Washington, D.C., at Constitution Hall, in Chicago, at the Mid-America Building, and in San Francisco at the Fairmont Hotel. It was not altogether a national lecture, but it came closer than any of the others had before or since. They now just settle down and give one piece of a lecture in Washington, and they don't even give that at Constitution Hall. They give it in some lecture place sometimes. So it's not any larger than this. So it's come down very significantly from the time when Saul Bella and people like that gave it in the 60s, 70s.
And that sets you off again.
Yeah. Well, I haven't settled down since that time.
You just turned 90 recently. Is that right?
Well, almost a year ago.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty recent.
One counts the days differently when one gets to be 90. Mm-hmm. So I was 90, 11 months and 12 days or whatever ago, and I'll be 91 in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks from next Friday, a week after Christmas.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned a couple of things in the introduction. You started out, you wanted to become a lawyer, but you had a little career problem happen there. You wanted to help your dad. And
yes,
then...
you see, there were a number of things I did not know. I did not know when I went to college that we were in the midst of the worst depression this country's ever had. And my father was absolutely poor, and I thought it was because he was a poor manager. There were two other things that caused him to be poor. One was that he was a black lawyer in a community which did not particularly relish black lawyers. And so he had a very difficult time building up a clientele. And the second was that he was practicing law in a community where there simply just wasn't any favorable disposition to use black lawyers or to retain them in any way. But when he came home without money every day, I thought that it was because he was a poor manager, poor thing. So if I rushed to law school, rushed back to Tulsa, and engaged him in the practice of law while I kept the books and collected the money, we would be on Easy Street in virtually no time at all. At the end of my freshman year, we lost our home, a fact from which I never did recover, never have recovered since. That when my brother came to get us, he came to get my sister and me at Fisk because I didn't know this, because they didn't have the fare to send for us. And so he came, he drove, and therefore he could bring us both back for the price of less than one. Moreover, when he got to Tulsa, he made a turn that I knew was not the turn to go home. And I wondered where he was going. And he was going to an apartment which was not home, and which I never regarded as home. But it was where my mother and my father had moved after they lost our home. And that
You lost your home?
Yes.
Because they
foreclosed. It was foreclosed because in a moment of expansion, he built an apartment building, a small apartment, a 4-family flat. And he thought that would bring in revenue. But it turned out that it brought in very little revenue, plus the fact that he couldn't make the payments on both the house and the apartment building. And since the apartment could bring some revenue in addition to housing us, they gave up the house and moved to the apartment. And we lived in 2 apartments, and they rented out the other 2. But I didn't know anything about that until I got home from my first year in college. It was a very sobering experience. I never have got over it. And when I got to the point where I was purchasing homes myself, I would make 2 down payments, 2 payments to catch up so they wouldn't put me out, you know. It was a horrible experience. I remember that even when I bought a home in Chicago, I paid... I would make payments. If I went out and gave a lecture, I'd come back and send that check to the loan company so that they wouldn't put us out, you know. And so I was never evicted. I boast of that now.
So you had a Professor Currier who really changed the course of your life, which therefore changed the course of our lives by association.
Yes. I don't know why the Franklin Center is near the railroad track.
That's for another discussion.
Maybe they're telling me something. I don't know. But hey, and so at Fisk, where I was, it was my freshman year. I had a course called American Civilization, Western Civilization. And a young white professor came in to give a series of lectures, about 4 lectures. And I had never seen a person perform like he did. And I had never seen a person quite so learned as he was. It was a curious combination of a nervous walking up and down, all up and down the front of the room, and at the same time putting out information by the barrel full, it seemed, which I had never known or had any contact with before. And he was the most impressive person I'd ever heard, literally. I was only 16, so I hadn't heard a lot of people, but he was the most impressive person I ever heard. And he gave 4 lectures, and I was curious about him, but I don't think I ever met him that fall. I I did meet him in the spring. When I decided I'd take a course, I had to have some more of this man, so I'd signed up for a course for the following fall, Survey of United States History. And he taught me that, and then he learned that I was interested in history. I'd never had history before like that. You know, in high school, I don't know whether it's true, but in my high school, it was the coach who taught history, you know.
Still happens a lot.
Filling out his section when he wasn't coaching the team. And so I didn't have this kind of history in high school. And it was so exciting to me that I took this course from him. And it was during that course that I decided that I just had to major in history. That's the only area of learning worth being concerned about. And so when I went home that summer, I told my father, I said, I don't know whether I should discuss this with you or not, but and I hope you don't feel too bad about it. He said, I said, but, you know, I've just changed my mind. I'm not going to be a lawyer. I want to be a historian, and I hope you have no serious objection to that. He said, objection? How can I object? He said, being a lawyer was your idea in the first place. and he said that, no, I don't mind if you want to be a historian. I do mind, though, if you are not the best historian you can be. The way I want you to be wanted you to be the best lawyer, since you said you wanted to be that. Whatever you want to be, he said, be the best that you can be. And if you do that, your mother and I will be very happy.
You took him really seriously your whole life.
Yeah. Well, I was fairly serious about that, and he was too. And so I went back to college my junior year with a burden off my shoulders. You know, the burden of being a lawyer was lifted from my shoulders, and I didn't think much more about it until I began teaching at Duke Law School, some 70 or 80 years later.
With Walter Dellinger?
Yes.
And Professor Luchtenberg.
Bill Luchtenberg.
Right.
I taught a course.
Right.
For 7 years I taught
right.
in law school. But I went back to Fisk, and this burden on my shoulders, I dug deep into the history. I took everything that Ted Currier gave, and since he was only 12 years older than I was, we became very fast friends. As I say in the autobiography, he's the first white man that I ever met who treated me as a social and intellectual equal. And we became fast friends for the rest of his life. And I had the feeling that as he took interest in me, he was projecting himself into me. He didn't even have a PhD. And the one thing he told me very early was that you've got to get a PhD.
And he helped you do that.
And he helped me do that. We were still bankrupt when I finished college. And when I couldn't go to Harvard, to which I had been admitted, Ted Currier went downtown in Nashville and went to his bank and borrowed $500 and came back out to the house where I was staying temporarily with him. He said, money will not keep you out of Harvard. Here. And he put $500 in my hand. And that night he put me on the train for Boston. And I won't say everything is history to that, but I went on from there and worked hard at Harvard. In 1935, there were not more than a half dozen African Americans at Harvard. 2 of them were in biology. And one of them was 2 of them in the law school, 2 in biology, 1 in history. And, there were 2 or 3 undergraduates. That was it. And I was there with my now $475 or something like that. Really loaded to the hilt, you see, with all this money. And even after I made the tuition payments, I was still fairly loaded. I know you wonder how was I loaded after I paid tuition at Harvard. But this is 1935. Tuition wasn't $30,000. Tuition for the entire year was $400. $100 down. I paid that. And then $100 in December, another in February, another in April. That's it. So I paid the $100, and I still had a fair amount. But I knew that since that had to last me the entire year, that I had to do something else. So I went out and got jobs. I worked. I washed dishes for my for my evening meal at the Paella Club, where I discovered that it was food much better than I could ever purchase. You see, and so I became one of the staunch dishwashers at the Paella Club, and then I took in typing, and I typed term papers and that sort of thing. I had a regular job though, typing a dissertation for a man who was a senior tutor at Dunster House, and Elliot Perkins, became a dear friend as well as a benefactor, and with doing term papers, typing his dissertation, and washing dishes, I was able to make ends meet. But I couldn't do that after my first year because I had won a fellowship then, and so you can't work on a fellowship at Harvard. And so I had a fellowship from Harvard, a fellowship from the Rosenwald Fund, and that did it. I had no financial worries after that in graduate school.
When you did graduate, then and you started teaching, you would get these summer appointments at universities. You had guest lectures. You had what my mother would have called you never had a real job, and that was an issue for you. You didn't have you weren't invited to have a full time.
Well, I had a job, St. Augustine's College in Raleigh, 4 years. North Carolina College for Negroes here in Durham for 4 years. But then there were all these people dangling things at me. And after I wrote From Slavery to Freedom, I got a real job at Howard University. And the problem there was, if I go to Howard now, I'm 32 years old. If I go to Howard now, I've got to spend the rest of my life there. There's nowhere else to go. That's the pinnacle. You can't go anywhere else but Howard. And do I want to spend 38 years or whatever it is there? Or do I want to wait and go when I'm really ripe, and mature? Well, I better not wait because it might not happen again. So I had to take it. So I took the job at Howard. Then people really of these places, Harvard invited me to teach summer school. And when I read the letter, I almost collapsed. I don't know whether you can't appreciate this, living as you do in 2005. But this is 1950, 55 years ago. And I got this invitation to teach at Harvard, summer school. Well, it was summer school, but it was teaching at Harvard, and although I was not ever enamored of Harvard, I'm still not.
Why is that?
I gave a talk at the Massachusetts Historical Society a few weeks ago in which I said that this was, I think, from my autobiography. I said, I found Harvard neither difficult nor interesting. And that you're saying that at the Massachusetts Historical Society takes courage and nerve and chutzpah. And I guess I had all three, but that's the way I felt about it then. And so when I was there, I I did not find it very interesting. I did not find it difficult. But then they began to dangle this at me. I thought they were dangling it, but it turned out they weren't really dangling. They had a firm grip on what they were holding above me, and they snatched it away at the end of the summer. There was not the slightest consideration that I would be teaching at Harvard more than the 6 weeks. Then I got an invitation to teach at the University of Wisconsin an entire semester. That was really something. The fanfare that was created as a result of my going there, Where am I going to stay? How is this going to be? Who's going to take care of my baby? We had a little boy by that time. He's 5 months old when we went to Wisconsin. Who's going to keep him warm in Wisconsin? That sort of thing. And but there wasn't the slightest thought of my being at Wisconsin more than a semester. Then in the summer of '53, I was invited to teach at Cornell University, and I went there, and you'll be very interested in this, but when we arrived there, this little boy, he's just learning to walk. My son, who is now 53. What's this? They want some? And we were pushing him in his little buggy cart in a supermarket with 3 African Americans who lived in Ithaca, who saw us and rushed over because they knew we were strangers. Every black person in Ithaca knew every other black person. And they said, welcome, are you visiting here? We said, no, we're visiting away, but we're here for the summer. They said, you summer? Yes. They said, where are you living? And I gave them the address. They said, no, you don't understand. You don't live there. You cannot live there. I said, well, I thought I was living there. And they said, what did you say your address was? I repeated the address. They said, you must be the new black professor. They said, otherwise you wouldn't be living there. I said, well, I am the new black professor and I'm living there. So, yeah. And we lived there that summer. It was a very interesting summer. One thing, when I came in to give my lecture one day, I saw students passing around a piece of paper, and they saw that I saw them, and I guess they became a little self-conscious about that. And so one of them that was sort of managing this paper going around came to me at the end of the class and said, I suppose you were wondering what piece of paper that was they passed around. I said, no, I hadn't thought about it. Except that I thought about it the entire hour. And he said, well, we were just passing around a petition to the Department of History, asking them to invite you to be a member of the department. And I didn't tell him he was wasting his time, which I thought to myself he was. And indeed he was wasting his time. I never got an invitation and didn't expect an invitation from the Department of History at Cornell University. And then I was making the rounds, and all this time I knew that this was a charade, that this was just putting on. This was a salve the conscience of the professors in these departments. They had no intention of inviting me to be a member. So when Thurgood Marshall called me in the summer of 1953, and I was at Ithaca, he said, John, what are you going to be doing this fall? I said, I'm going back to my job at Howard University. Where else? What do you think I'll be doing in the fall? He said, well, you know what else you'll be doing? And then he said, you'll be working for me. I said, what? He said, yes, and if you don't agree to work with me. And then he spun off all these profanities that only a Thurgood Marshall could issue. That's what would happen to me if I didn't agree to assist him in Brown against the board. And then from the end of the summer of 1952 to the fall, 53 to the fall of 53, I was going from Washington, D.C. to New York City every weekend, that is, from about Thursday to Sunday, working in the offices of the NAACP, League of Defense and Education Fund, to help him answer the questions which had been raised by the court when it remanded the case back for argument in the spring of 53. And they were questions which had been raised by the court which could not be answered by anyone except the historians on the state of things in the spring of in 1868, when the United States Congress was considering the 14th Amendment, and what was the state of the art with respect to that? What was the attitude? What was the intention of the framers of the 14th Amendment, and so forth? Well, they were questions which we had wrestled with in the Reconstruction period. Those who were students of the Reconstruction period we had wrestled with those questions, and he wanted me to wrestle with them some more and give them the answers, which we did to the best of our ability in the summer and fall of 1953. I don't think we ever answered those questions satisfactorily, because to put it very bluntly, I don't believe that the Congress, when it considered the 14th Amendment, was considering segregated schools as such, and that's what they wanted to know, whether Congress had in mind the desegregation of the schools. Well, I don't think Congress did have that in mind, but I didn't say that. I didn't think that. And we worked diligently to give them the answers that we could. But when I say I don't think we answered those questions satisfactorily, I don't think they were answers. But what we did do, and this was important, we gave to legal counsel for Linda Brown, we gave them a sense of understanding the ins and outs, the problems of the late 1860s, and what was going on in the country. And they had a familiarity with the period. They could talk about the members of Congress and the members of the Supreme Court and the members of the Constitutional Conventions of the various states and so forth. They could talk about those things with ease and grace, and they could discuss with the court those problems. And I think that gave the court a sense of understanding and appreciation for the capacity of these lawyers for Linda Brown to expatiate on the problems to the point that they were pleased to learn that these learned gentlemen knew what they were talking about.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Northern and Southern racism. You know, it's interesting because just in today's News and Observer, I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, there are two articles today. One is about the Wilmington riots, and one is about discovering slaves in New York, and that there were, in fact, an equal number, if not more. I was surprised to read in your book that 3/4 of Southerners did not have slaves.
That's true. I'll be brief on this because this is the period in which I worked so long, and I might know more about this than I know about what happened yesterday. That is that it is very difficult to make a sharp and clear distinction between the attitudes of race in the North and the attitudes of race in the South. There are people who tell you, I've never been south. Like they've never been to hell and back, never been there. I've only been to New York. Well, that's one hell of a place. You can catch it in New York. There's as much racism in New York per square block as there is in Mississippi per square block. They might polish it over a bit and have it look very neat. But the worst race experiences I've had have been in New York.
You were at Brooklyn College.
Yes. Don't tell me about New York. And anyone who has the notion that there is a distinction ought to see that exhibit at the New York Historical Society on slavery in New York, which is this article is about. And I saw that a few weeks ago. It is most remarkable, and I don't know that there's anything that has depressed me more in studying South Carolina or Mississippi than in studying that exhibit in New York about slavery in New York. So that there's not all that different. For the numbers here don't mean much. It is what goes on in a community where the institution exists, where the institution of slavery exists, what goes on, and what will be the heritage, or what will be the residue of that experience for later generations. And by the time I got to New York in 1956 to be the chair of the Department of History at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, slavery had been over quite a while. But when I went out to look for a house in the Brooklyn College neighborhood, which is one of the finest residential sections of the city, no real estate dealer in Brooklyn would show me a house. Not one. Not one would show me a house. I was somewhat brought to my senses. It was very heady for me to have my picture on the front page of the New York Times when I went to Brooklyn College, because it was an unheard of thing. And I was sort of up there, until I went to look for a house. And then I was brought down by these people who said that despite the fact you teach our children, you're not fit to live among us. And I could write, as I say in Mirror to America, I could write a book about my experiences in trying to find shelter in New York City. You see? So don't tell me about the differences between South Carolina and New York. I know the differences. And they're not as great as what we think. They might have developed some specialties in Mississippi and South Carolina that they haven't developed in New York, but they've got their fill of racism in New York, and that's all I'm going to say about that.
You've been actually chronicling and making history your whole life, and you've also been an activist historian. How do you reconcile being someone who records history, who researches history, and then becomes an activist for some of the things you discover?
Well, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to even pretend to be both. And I would argue, as I have on numerous occasions, that if you're going to be a historian of this country in the 21st century, you have to be an activist. And yet, being an activist puts your skills as a historian at risk. But it's very difficult to do both. It's like walking a tightrope. It's very difficult. For the things that caused me to discover and to write objectively about the historical experience of, say, North Carolina, are also the things which raise one's temperament, feelings, etc. And yet, at the same time, you must use this information to try to rectify the ills and mistakes of our society. That's very difficult. And you might lose respect or position in one area if you overdo it in another area, in the other area. It's very difficult. So it's a balancing act all the time. And I've written about this in essays more than in my autobiography. But one must do it. One must do it. I cannot keep all the information I have about the 19th century and about the 20th century without using it in every way I can to change things in the 21st century, you see. So that takes some doing. But it's some doing that one has to undertake. Otherwise, one wastes one's talent in useless activity. And one must use it in constructive activity. That's from my point of view. And therefore, you have to work hard to keep the balance, but you have to work hard to achieve some change, bring about change.
So when President Clinton appointed you, well, actually, you met with President Clinton and Al Gore before he was even president, when they had that breeze through here.
Yes, they came
when
right
they
through
were campaigning,
here.
and
Yes.
they actually met with you. He was 2 hours late. But
Yes.
but he met with you, both of them met with you to have a kind of freewheeling conversation about race that then led to appointing you to head up the initiative later on.
There's one error, Linda. We didn't talk about race at all.
Oh, I thought you did.
Here in Durham.
What did you talk about?
Well, let me set this up. He called, one of his advanced people called me a couple of days before and said that Governor Clinton was coming through Durham and he was speaking at North Carolina Central. And could I arrange my schedule so that he wanted to meet me, and could I arrange my schedule so that I could meet him? I said, well, I felt like a doctor, you know.
Can I squeeze you in?
I said, I'll work him in. I'll squeeze him in. So I went down there and spent the whole afternoon waiting for him because he's late. He was late. I learned that was characteristic of him. He's late. He's always late. But when he got here, finally, they canceled a lot of things. But when he got here, his advanced people came to me and said that the governor has had to cancel a lot of activities. This reception, he can't go to the reception. So can you come to the bus? He's going to work the crowd, and then he'll come to the bus, and he'll meet you there. And so I went to the bus after he made the speech.
Where was the bus?
The bus was up at the end of one camp, up at the end of the campus.
Uh-huh.
And I went up there and I waited there for him, Walter Dellinger, I waited for him. And then Al Gore came with his little daughter, and then Hillary came with Chelsea, and then the governor came finally, and we talked. Now, what did we talk about? We talked about the origins of man. We talked about whether civilization emerged in Africa before it emerged in Europe. And we talked about things as esoteric as that. And finally someone said, "It's late, we got to leave." And so they left for Wilmington. Nothing said about race at all. I think they were just sort of sizing me up, and they got interested in, they both were terribly interested in the subjects that we were discussing, both of them. And it was animated, and we really forgot the time, We were just talking. And somebody said, "It's too late, we got to go." And then that just brought us back to reality. And that's what we did. That's what we did. That's all we did. And I didn't hear from or see them anymore until Al Gore called me and said he wanted to put on some discussions at the Vice President's house up near Observatory Hill in Washington. And he said, I'll provide the place, I'll even provide the food if you provide the direction for the talks we want to make. We want to talk about race. And this was after he'd been president for a year.
Then the media defined what you were doing in the Initiative on Race as a debate, not a conversation.
Yes.
I wonder if you'd read this little part right here from the outset.
Yes. From the outset, it was clear that the media defined conversation on race as a debate. If there were no fireworks, that was clear evidence that nothing of importance was being accomplished. If there were, then necessarily something was amiss. Confrontation became the litmus test for a meaningful dialogue. The board was criticized for not having one or more members opposed to affirmative action. Presumably, starker disagreements among board members would have been beneficial. Similarly, the board meeting, quote, wandered, unquote, or, quote, floundered, unquote, if it failed to hotly debate some subject. It was widely and inaccurately reported that I had said that conservatives would not be invited to the meetings because they had nothing to contribute. I denied this numerous times and repeatedly sent corrective letters to editors who had attributed such a statement to me. None of them printed my letters. Newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune, which sent no reporter to any board meetings, accepted the fact the Times reportage and decried my supposed misconduct. Well, the president appointed the members of his advisory board on race on the 13th of June, 1997, and then he took us all to San Diego, at the University of California, San Diego, where he was delivering the commencement address. And we all flew out with the president on Air Force One. A newspaper was later to say that I had never had a face-to-face conversation with the president.
As a historian, these inaccuracies must drive you crazy.
Oh, no, they don't. I guess I'm already crazy, or that's par for the course.
Do you think?
And I was not terribly surprised. I was surprised at well, you get to the point where you believe the New York Times, and that's a very dangerous point to be. I haven't read it this morning, and I sort of feel like I'm deprived because I haven't read it yet today. And the New York Times has resources that no other newspaper has in this country. The New York Times is the only newspaper that could put a person on the President's Advisory Board on Race, so they could assign someone to do that specifically and to spend all of his time doing that. And they did that. And all these other newspapers were just sort of drooling and copying. What does the Times say? And they would take that account and mess it up and print it as though they had some representative there. So when Stephen Holmes twisted, as he did, he's the special representative for the New York Times. There every time we opened the door, every time we met, he was there. So when Stephen Holmes says that I did something, they all say, "Oh yes, the Times said it. We write it down too." So that when Stephen Holmes said this, that it was not possible for the President Advisory Board on Race to do well or to do properly, to do their job properly, because Franklin had said that he didn't want any conservatives on the board. Franklin said that we were doing all right without this sort of thing. Then the Chicago Tribune, where I spent years in Chicago. Chicago Tribune says, "Poor Franklin, who has now ruined his distinguished career by his saying these things," as though they were there and heard me say them things. They never checked with me, never asked me, "Franklin, did you say that?" Never did they do that, because they felt, as so many of us feel, that if it's in the Times, it's true, and it's just not so. Just not so.
We're getting near the end, and I do want you to talk a little bit, if you'd like, about the influence and partnership of your late wife Aurelia on your life.
Well, when President Clinton met with me, and he and I did the same thing you and I are doing.
Wait a minute.
Well, he did. He served as the questioner at the New York Public Library, and he said to me, he said, "John, I knew you. I got to know you well." He said, "But I never got to know Aurelia well." And he said, "I am astounded at your delineation of her character in this book." He said, I didn't know that you had this anchor, this strength by your side." He said, and he said, I think you're very fortunate to have had this. Well, Aurelia was my first date in college. She had just turned 16, and I was already 16 years and 9 months, and I invited her to go to the homecoming game with me in October, on the 31st of October, 1931, and then to the dance that night, the homecoming dance. She was beautifully outfitted that day for the game. I don't know if I can see her right now, what she had on. And that evening, I had to work because I was working in the Office of Public Relations at Fisk. And so she came to the dance alone, and I joined her there. By the time I got there, these characters were swarming around, and I didn't, get away, here, I have arrived. And that was the beginning of our long love affair, courtship, and marriage. We were married on the 11th of June, 1940. By that time, we had really dated for 9 years. And even in our absence, when I was in graduate school and she was teaching, or she was in graduate school, we didn't. We made no demands of each other. I dated, and she did too. Matter of fact, when I went to Hampton University, where she was in library school, to give her her engagement ring, I got there a day early, and she said, "I'm so sorry, I have a date tonight." She said, "But I'll cancel." I said, "No, you won't either." I said, No, just keep the date. Just keep the date." And
What did you do the evening that she had the date?
I went to bed and rested because I had just come out of my PhD orals, and I was worn out. I was sort of glad that she. Well, I won't repeat that sentence. But all that time we knew that we were going to be. We were meant for each other. We felt we were. And even though her parents, I won't go into this, it's discussed in Mirror to America, her parents were resisting our getting married, very vigorously resisting, and broke us up at one point. We then got back together and got married immediately in 11th of June 1940, and I took her to, first we spent our honeymoon at the Bureau of the Census in Washington, where I was in the middle of doing some research on free Negroes in North Carolina, which was my doctoral dissertation. And she sat by me, just as Linda's sitting by me, and working with me on the microphone, not on the manuscripts. The manuscripts, since this before they microfilmed. I have them now in my room. We worked together side by side there in the Bureau of the Census, and then we went over to the Library of Congress and the National Archives. We spent a week there before I went up to Cambridge to begin the writing of my dissertation. And she would go to the library with me sometimes there, or she would go to the Fogg Art Museum, or to the Widener Library, where she'd never seen a library that big, and we were always working together there. We'd take the evenings off. We went to the Boston Symphony, Pop's concerts down on the Esplanade on the river, and we did a lot of things like that on Sundays, weekends. But we worked. I was writing for the first time. I was beginning to write my dissertation. And Professor Schlesinger was very cordial to me, and Mrs. Schlesinger too, and so were the Bucks. He was my supervisor. And they were so kind to me. And I remember one afternoon, we were at the Schlesinger's house for supper. But before we ate, it was bright, sunny, late afternoon. Paul Buck took Aurelia aside, and I saw them over there in the garden, chatting, rather animatedly, and I did become curious about what they were talking about. And so, but I didn't say anything. We got back home, and I said, "You and Paul Buck had a real conversation, didn't you? What's going on?" She said, "Oh yeah." She said, "You know, we had a very animated and interesting conversation." She said that he said that he wasn't certain about me. He had everything he saw about me was impressed, but he thought maybe that I had something, that maybe I was on my way somewhere. And if he was right in his belief that maybe I'm on my way, he hoped that Aurelia would do everything to assist me and would not stand in my way. And she said, I reminded him that we had already been together for 10 years. And I know him fairly well, and I think he's on his way. And there's nothing would please me more than to see him go where he wants to go. And that relieved Paul Buck greatly. He never talked to me about that, but he and Aurelia became sort of friends on their own from that point on. And it was later that there were other opportunities and tests, occasions for her to show what a remarkably unselfish person she was and how committed she was. I know when I was writing From Slavery to Freedom here in Durham in 1946 and 47, we lived on Linwood Avenue in an apartment about as big as one of these studies in this building, living room, dining room, kitchen, you know. And one day she saw me, and I had there were no study rooms at the library at North Carolina College. There were no offices for teachers. And if I had worked there, I had to work in the library on the same table with students, which I did not want to do. Or in our apartment. I worked at Duke, but I didn't have a place to work at Duke. I went out to Duke to work in the stacks, to work in the, to pull out information, or in the manuscripts room, where Nanny Tilly and so forth were writing. Yes, they were very good to me, but I didn't want to set up shop there, right there. I was supposed to do research and so forth, so I did. The only place I had to do research was in the house where we lived, and in the kitchen, where the only table in the house was. So if Maria was getting dinner after a long day's work, she was working too. And we were getting dinner together most of the time. There was nothing in the house that she did that I wouldn't do or that I couldn't do. If I got home first, I started cooking. If she got home first, she started cooking. But there I am, if she's cooking, and she's setting the table, and I'm there at the table, the one table in the house, writing. That's not really conducive to dinner getting or writing. So she said one night, she said, "Why don't you? She said, you can't finish this book here." She said, "Why don't you go to Washington? Just go to Washington and work at the Library of Congress." I said, "How am I going to Washington?" She said, I'm working, and if I'm working, you got money to go to Washington. So I'll send you to Washington. I'll send you money, whatever you need. I'll send it to you." And with that, I said, "Well, all right." I packed up my things and went to Washington, and sure enough, she blessed me with a steady income while I was there. So much so that the book is dedicated to her. And I always like to say that the book was the result of a subvention from the Aretha Franklin Foundation.
Together you penned at your 50th anniversary, you penned a paper together.
Yes.
About how you managed it.
Well, first place, we had gone to Brazil. One of the things that I did for Rita was that when our son was young and she couldn't travel with me, I went a lot of places. I went to India for the centennial of the Indian universities. I went to Europe. I lectured in Cambridge University as a visiting professor one summer. So she always graciously said, just go ahead. I'll tend to it. I'll take care of him. So on and so on. So when he got up and out, I was happy. If for no other reason, I could then take her with me wherever I went. And we did. We retraced our steps. Went to Central America, South America. We went to Brazil, and she said one day, we were in Brazil, she said, "This is a good place. We could spend our 50th anniversary here." I said, "That's a deal." And so we did spend our 50th anniversary in Rio. My regret is now that we didn't spend it in Salvador, which I like much better than I do. But we did. We went everywhere. I took her to India, which she'd never been. She had not been to Australia where I'd been. I took her to Australia on another trip, and we went everywhere together. And I felt that I couldn't do enough. I couldn't do enough to repay her for all the sacrifice she made to keep pushing me on and helping me in every way possible. So that it was a wonderful, beautiful affair. that lasted until the 27th of January 1999. She died. That's enough.
I want to thank you so much for this privilege. And for somebody who's covered this century, historically, there's so much to talk about. And to me, this is just a tease. But so wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Nice seeing you again.
Nice seeing you. I didn't see you. I was in the shop yesterday, day before
I'll
yesterday.
take care of this.
Thank you.
Not at the Paradise.
Okay. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Hi, fine. How are you?
It's Bernie, B-E-R-N-I-E.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. My pleasure indeed.
Thank you.
Hi. How are you?
Thank you so much. Anjali, A-N-J-A-L-I.